So this is next episode for Open Web Builders podcast. This is Sasha, and here we have Avichal today from Electric Capital. So we're gonna dive into, first we're gonna start with the background of Avichal, and then we're gonna go into use cases, adoption, Electric Capital, many other things. Sounds good?
Yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So quick question. So how did you get interested in PM role back in the day?
Yeah, so I started my career as a product manager at Google. I worked on search ranking and ads ranking. So still relatively technical. I have a computer science background, and actually was considering kind of the two job offers I had at the time was being a software engineer at Amazon was kind of the one I was considering. And the second was to be an associate product manager at Google. And I really wasn't sure what a PM did. But the thing that actually tipped me over to taking the Google offer was I did an interview loop. And usually when you go interview at a company, there's, you might talk to 6 or 7 or 8 people. And then there's like 1 or 2 people on the interview loop, and you're like, this guy kind of sounds like a bozo. Like, how does he work at this great company? Like, maybe he's really brilliant at something, but I kind of missed how this person was like very unimpressive. And on my interview loop at Google, nobody was unimpressive. I was just blown away by how good everybody was. And it's because my interview loop was people like Marissa Mayer, right? It's just like, she was my first boss. And so the people from that era like went on to, it's like Brett Taylor, who's president of Salesforce, and Jess Lee, who was over at Sequoia, and like the people running Android and Google VR, and like these are all the people that were, like my managers and my mentors and my peers. And so it was just such a crazy time to be at Google that the interview loop was so amazing that I said, I don't know what this job means exactly, but I think I should just go hang out with these people. And like every time I've just followed the smartest people I know into doing something, amazing stuff has happened. And so I kind of accidentally ended up as a PM, at Google.
And how did you decide then to go into entrepreneurship after that?
That was also, it's sort of just market pull. So I'd started a company in college that started doing test prep, like SAT, ACT prep. And we wrote a bunch of software for personalizing education online using software. And we put it out on there on the internet, and it started to get organic traction. And we got it to like low single-digit millions in revenue, in recurring revenue, just like as a side project. And so I was doing this while I was at Google. I was CTO at this company, so I wrote the code and the machine learning systems. And it kind of just had such product market fit that we were kind of blown away. And my co-founder was in business school, and so he was sort of pushing on the sales side, and he was entering business plan competitions. And because the business was really working, we were like winning all of these business plan competitions. And so we were like, and it was kind of hilarious because I was in the press. I was, like the Fortune 30 under 30, Business Week used to have one, and we like won a big like national business plan competition. So it's kind of weird because I was like on the cover of magazines while I had a job at Google for this company. But actually Google was, at the time, I don't know how they would deal with it today. I mean, it's a very different company, 15 years later. But at the time, Marissa was just super cool about it. So I remember actually once we were like on the cover of some magazine, and somebody like brought it in, and so she like brought it over, and she was like, "Hey, this is awesome! Like super cool, good job." And I think they were okay with it because I was doing quite well at Google, and so I think as far as they were concerned, was like I was doing great at work. So what do they care what I did in my free time? And so that company was just doing so well that at a certain point we said, you know what, this is like a good business. We've been able to hire a bunch of people and not raise any funding, and like the business is working. Maybe we should just go focus on this. Like, what would happen if we actually spent a bunch of time on it? And so then we started to go full time on it and raised a private equity round actually, and scaled it up, and then eventually sold that company.
I see. And so how did you transition? How did that happen? So you sold the company,
Yeah.
You still was at Google at the time?
Well, so I left Google, went full-time at that company, we scaled it up, we raised some money, we scaled it up, we ended up selling that business, and then a good friend of mine from college and grad school, Curtis, he'd also started a company, and he'd sold that to Cosmix, which then became Walmart Labs. And so he and I were freed up at the same time, and we decided to start our second company together, which is the company that we sold to Facebook, and then Curtis and I have worked together for over 10 years now. So we started that company, sold it to Facebook, worked together at Facebook, started Electric Capital together. So we've been joined at the hip for like 10 years now.
How did you decide in terms of selling those two companies versus continue running them? What was the decision-making process?
That's a really good question. So on the first one, we lived through 2008. So we raised, the business was going well, we raised money in the summer of 2008, and then in the fall of 2008, the market crashed. And we looked like geniuses because we had raised a huge amount of money right before the crash. And then on the other side of it, our business just sort of evaporated. Like it tanked because everybody stopped spending money for about 12 months. And then we spent the next couple of years kind of rebuilding the business. And there's a whole sort of separate long story there about how our investors got really freaked out, and they had kind of a liquidity crunch on their own, and thought that actually potentially the best course of action for our business would potentially be to sell it, which would have been, selling a business in 2009 after the correction would have been the absolute worst time to sell a company. And so we fought them pretty hard. Fortunately, they didn't control the board, but we ended up having to do later in 2009 was essentially buy them out. So we essentially took all the money in the bank, bought them out, and then ran the business month to month on a credit line until the market came back, and then scaled the business up and ended up eventually selling it. The decision on that one was we realized that the market was not going to support a $1 billion company doing what we were doing. We were just way too early. So a lot of the stuff that's happening today on mobile with personalized education, I mean, to put this in context, we started this company like pre-iPhone, right? So, and pre-iPad. And so like the idea of delivering education in a personalized way, we were just kind of 10 years too early. Like it really should have been done in 2015, 2016, not in 2006. And so we just were too early to market, and so we sold. And for the second one, it's a much longer story, but it actually touches on how both we decided to sell the company, but also how we got into crypto for the first time. So what this company was doing was it was kind of like a TiVo for your phone. So you could give us a URL. We would crawl on the back end, on the server side, we would crawl whatever the URL was and take all the media and the content and make a copy of it on your phone. So this was in 2010 when like Android 2.2 and 2.3 was just happening and Android was just starting to become useful. And at the time, people were trying to make Flash work on their phone. And you had really goofy sort of edge cases. Like you could have your phone sitting on Wi-Fi on your couch at home, and you could have your laptop open on the same Wi-Fi network right next to you. And if you tried to access Hulu on your laptop, it was free. And if you tried to access Hulu on your phone, they wanted you to pay $10. And so it just made no sense. We were in this weird transition phase where nothing really made sense and everything on mobile was broken. And so we built a bunch of tech that just made all of that seamless. You didn't have to think about file formats. You didn't have to think about how the media got to where it was. We broke through all the paywalls. Like we did a bunch of really cool stuff. And the content people hated us because we circumvented all the paywalls basically. And so there was a bunch of sort of legal wrangling there. And the technology was very real and it was patented. And so it made a lot of sense to ultimately just sell the company and make sure we generate a good return for the investors. And the path forward kind of on the consumer side was going to be very, very hard. But one of the options we considered, this was in like early 2012, was becoming Bitcoin miners. Because in 2011, Curtis and I were just mining at home, just for fun. Curtis comes from a distributed systems background. And so what we were really good at, it turns out, was we bought all of this remnant server inventory in these data centers all over the world that weren't Amazon, because that's how we could crawl the web and do all the stuff that we were doing. And so we built kind of this like thin Kubernetes light kind of layer on top of all of these data centers where we could control the servers. And so we could just instrument them to do whatever we wanted. This is like pre-Kubernetes, pre-Docker era. And so we said, well, maybe we should just become Bitcoin miners because we have all this machine inventory for super cheap. And then we said, nah, this Bitcoin thing's probably never going to go anywhere. We should just sell to Facebook, which obviously worked out fine. And so we stuck around as hobbyists for a long time. And so we sort of kept the Bitcoin that we mined. And over the years, Curtis was mining like Ethereum and Monero. And so after about 5 years at Facebook, we'd been doing this stuff as hobbyists for a little bit. And when we decided to leave, we were exploring what to do. And very quickly, we realized that crypto and blockchain was the space that we wanted to be in. And to us, it was because for the first time in maybe 15 years, it felt kind of like the internet. Like we felt like we had seen the future and nobody else had seen it yet. And there were a lot of signals for us there. There were things like, the people who were there, you had academics that were leaving tenured positions to go start projects. You had like the true fringes of technology had all left the mainstream internet and moved over here for philosophical reasons, not money-based reasons. It wasn't that you could make a ton of money doing this stuff in like 2016 yet. It was primarily sort of philosophically driven. And that to us was a signal that something was going on here. And so we just started sort of dabbling again after we left in crypto, and that eventually became Electric.
Did you consider starting another company in the blockchain space?
We thought about it a lot, actually. Our take was we could have done it. If we were to do it, probably the best route for us would have been to do some sort of an exchange. It's a network effect, two-sided marketplace. So we learned a lot of things at Facebook that we could have done. It's user-facing and would have been a product problem. But a lot of the really interesting, truly disruptive stuff, like the things that look counterintuitive, and if they work, they just fundamentally change everything. They disrupt massive, trillion-dollar markets, were really at layer one. They were really sort of in the foundational infrastructure phases. And I think our strengths are maybe, 2 levels higher in the stack. Like we understand how to bring products to market and think about user experience and design and product and business and all these other things that are well integrated. And so, could we out execute the Near team or Vitalik, or the Bitcoin core devs kind of at layer one? Probably not. We could maybe go build that team and try to compete. And so the approach we decided to take was much more one of, well, there are all these brilliant people who are world experts at these things. And we have skills that are extremely complementary about how to think about taking all of that technical prowess and bringing it to market in the right ways, and thinking about building developer ecosystems and thinking about scaling your organization and building the right products and so on. And so the way that we can have the biggest impact in the world over the next decade may actually be to just partner up with these people and try to help them. And so that's what we decided to do instead of starting our own.
And how do you approach now helping companies? As when you invest in companies, how closely versus not you work with portfolio companies? How do you think about it overall?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and the answer is a little bit counterintuitive, I think, to most people who have not done a lot of investing. Like Curtis and I had been pretty active angel investors outside of crypto for a few years, and so we invested in kind of up the middle, like SaaS products, Threads or Notion or Optimizely, or a lot of things that are also more frontier tech, things like Cruise or Boom Supersonic or Color Genomics, kind of like frontier tech and obviously crypto. And one of the things that we've come to believe is actually you don't want to make an investment when you think you can help. You actually want to make an investment where you're pretty sure they don't need your help. That's actually the signal that you should invest. So in a bizarre way, if you feel like you can help, you probably should not invest. And if you feel like you're going to give these people money and you may never talk to them again and probably the right stuff will happen, you should probably invest. And there are actually venture firms that take that approach where literally they're like, we give you money and then we don't talk to you because we get out of your way. That in your job is to be successful. And that's the bar that you want to shoot for as an investor, is this person is so good that they're going to do a job better than me. Now, in practice, of course, no team is perfect, and there are always ways that you can plug in and be helpful and add value. But if you sort of keep that bar in mind, in a counterintuitive sense, you actually want to invest in people that don't need your help. They'll probably win without you, and then you go help them, and the likelihood that they win ends up going up even more, and the scale of outcome that they have goes up even more. And so that's generally how we think about it. We try to find people that are working on things that we think they're technically exceptional. The team itself is very, very strong and well-rounded, and frankly probably doesn't need us. But when we do plug in and help, then we're able to accelerate what they're doing to a degree where the outcomes will be even larger. And we work with the Near team, for example, and it definitely feels like that, right? It's just like if we don't talk for a month, all of the right stuff happens. And if we do talk, hopefully more right stuff happens, right? And we can accelerate some of those things. But by and large, I think actually you want to invest in people that kind of don't need your help.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can jump into also your thesis on the space, because you wrote the article in mid-2018, Programmable Money. How do you think about it right now, after some time has passed and you looked at many different companies and attempts of doing different things in the space?
Yeah, so we don't publish that often. We are generally pretty quiet. We try to focus on working with founders and teams and trying to do the real work instead of making a lot of noise. But every now and then we publish something. And so we published this thing in 2018 on our blog called Programmable Money. And it was actually just the formalization of a thesis that we've had since probably 2015 or 2016. So it's actually, if you look back at our investments in crypto, we've stuck basically to that thesis the entire time. Even as angel investors prior to Electric, we stuck to that thesis. And the sort of root of it, I'll just walk you through maybe a really quick abridged version of it, is for the first time what we have is a potentially digitally native store of value, where the bits in the computer are the money, which is very different than the existing financial system, where you do have a ledger and your bank has some entry and it says you have such and such money, but it's really just an IOU from the bank. If you go to the bank, they'll give you some cash. It's not that the bits in the computer are the money. And so if you sort of take that one step further and you say, well, if the bits in the computer are the money, why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because now what that means is that computers can own money. Like computers and machines and software can take custody of money. And so for the first time, a human can pay a machine without another human in the loop. Or a machine can pay another machine without a human even being involved. And if you play that forward one step further, you say, well, why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because there is a set of stuff that computers are better than humans at. And strictly speaking, there's only one thing computers are better than humans at. And that is that computers are better than humans at deterministically executing some set of instructions on some future time horizon. Right? That's literally what computer code is. It's like, do this, and the same thing happens every time. And if you think about the world, a lot of the world is, here's a huge pile of money, and here's a bunch of rules around that money about who has access to that money and when that money can move. And on some future time horizon, I need you to execute some instructions, right? That's a will, and that's a trust, and that's an escrow, and that's a mortgage, and that's a HELOC, and that's an options contract, and that's a securities contract, and it's a derivative. Like literally $100 trillion of the world is, here's a pile of money, and here's a bunch of rules around that money and how the money can move around. And so now what you have is an infrastructure where money is digital, computers can take ownership of money, and computers are strictly better at executing instructions. And so it's such a perfect match for this $100 trillion slice of the world that has previously been untouched because software couldn't actually solve those problems natively, that we think that over the next 20 to 30 years, this programmable money stack, which is what we call it, is just going to eat up that $100 trillion of the world. And it feels to us a lot like, if you go back, it was before our time, but I went back and read a bunch of press and books and articles from the early 90s. And you see a really similar pattern where everybody that was really plugged into the internet very quickly realized that what it was about communication and information. Literally, it was called the information superhighway. And so you could see that anything that was about people needing to communicate and people, the cost of communication going basically to zero, that it was going to eat up newspapers and television and education, and everybody's going to be video chatting with each other one day. And it would make commerce really, really fast and efficient because you could execute what used to be a catalog, and you'd have to call somebody, make it on the phone. You could do it, it was a communication problem. You could make that happen on the internet. And so all of these problems were sort of obvious that they were just going to get eaten up over the next 20 to 30 years. And of course, it took a lot longer than people thought, right? In the 90s, people thought newspapers are dead, and it took another 25 years for that to really happen. And so to us, it sniffs very, very similar. It's just the infrastructure is such a perfect fit for this. The programmable money infrastructure is such a perfect fit for fintech and finance and money movement that it's just going to eat all of that up over the next 20 to 30 years.
Now, what do you think about the state of the ecosystem right now? Because you guys also doing the report for developer report, right? Where you look at GitHub repos. So where do you think we are overall in the space?
It's still very early, and so there are kind of a couple of facets to that. So, if you look at the developer report, the reason we do it is back to this sort of fundamental philosophical belief that if you just go where the smartest people are, tremendous value gets created, right? That's why I went to Stanford. That's why I went to Google. That's why I was so happy when Curtis decided to start a company with me. It's just like you find the smartest people in the world. I was thrilled when Nir let us invest. It's just like you find the smartest people in the world and you're like, I'm just going to hang out with you, and then amazing stuff happens. So for us, when you see developers taking time, which is even more precious an asset than money, if they're taking their time and devoting it to something, that's a really strong signal. That's a very, very good early leading indicator that something is going to happen. And I think I want to say it's Chris Dixon has this sort of phrase that's something, I'm going to butcher it, but it's roughly whatever software engineers are doing for fun on the weekends is probably what you'll do for a job in 10 years. And so when we're looking at all of these part-time developers writing code in their spare time in these ecosystems, to us, there's no stronger leading indicator of where value will accrue and how it will be created. And so we built this infrastructure that crawls all of GitHub and indexes it and fingerprints all the code, and then we can kind of see who's creating original content and original code commits and where those are being pulled in and merged and so on. And we can use that to fingerprint kind of what's happening in open source crypto as a whole. And what we've seen is that there is a steady increase in the number of developers coming in. And in fact, when prices go down, the number of developers doesn't actually go down. The number of full-time committed people that are writing code doesn't go down. What goes down is the rate of growth. So actually, it's like the first derivative is actually correlated to price, which is more and more people are coming in every year. It's just that the rate of growth changes with respect to the price. So that's a really positive indicator because you start looking at the absolute numbers now, and you have several thousand engineers that are writing code in the crypto ecosystem. And to benchmark that against things like Linux or Apache and these ecosystems that have really laid the foundation for the internet, we're actually not that far off in terms of amount of manpower that's going in, and the number of engineering hours that are going into this stuff now. So to us, as that number continues to go up, as those wins continue to compound, as that code continues to get baked, you're just going to see an exponential growth in sort of the amount of value that gets created. And that doesn't even count, all of the things that are not yet open source that are being worked on, right? There's actually several $1 billion worth of investment that's happened, whether you're counting Coinbase and Binance as sort of non-open source ecosystems, or things like Oasis or Near. Have you open sourced anything yet? Some stuff.
Oh yeah, everything's open source actually.
Oh, everything. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if the core had been open sourced yet. I think there are a lot of teams that are sort of working until they get very close to launch, and then they open source. And so there's actually a lot of people working closed source right now. And so we think it's actually a pretty big undercounting of what's actually happening. And so over the next 3 years, we expect a lot of that value to start to be apparent. And that's the leading indicator we're looking at.
How do you think execution is different in blockchain space versus traditional internet, and what is also kind of like missing? Like you've probably seen like a lot of teams executing. Did you see, first of all, like is there a difference between Web 2 and kind of like this new way of building protocols versus companies? And also, like, do you see that all kinds of talent entering the space? Like, do we have like diversity of people, like product people, repeat entrepreneurs, all kinds of other people entering versus not?
Yeah. So in terms of how it's similar or different, I think in many ways it is different, because once these things are live, it's much harder to evolve a dynamic, open source, consensus-driven system. Right. A distributed system just has a bunch of challenges with it that come with its distributed nature. But I think it's not as different as people might make it out to be. Like, I think these sorts of engineering challenges exist in a lot of domains, right? Like if you're building an operating system and you're going to push it to a bunch of mobile devices, it's similar. Like people are not going to upgrade. Even if you're building a mobile app, we used to see this at Facebook all the time. There are very, very large percentages of the world that just never update their app. So whatever you ship is like the thing that they have for the next 3 years. And so they're actually not that different in many ways. And I actually think in the most important ways, they're not that different, in that ultimately, if you don't have a clear sense for what you're building and who you're building it for and what problem you're solving, you're probably going to build a thing that nobody cares about. And if you look back at the Bitcoin white paper, you look at the Ethereum early white papers, they're pretty clear about the problems that they're trying to solve and the opportunities that they see in the world. It's not a like build it and they will come. They talk about payments, they talk about financial contracts, they talk about insurance, they talk about like the things that are broken in the world and the things they're trying to fix. And I think too often in crypto, people say, oh, it's different, we're building a protocol. But that's really just, in my opinion, a lot of times it's intellectual laziness. It's an unwillingness to get concrete about what problem are you solving and why is that a meaningful problem, and how do you know it's a real problem, and who are the users that have that problem, and how are you going to get to those users? And I think a lot of times it's because the technical challenges are so interesting that people who are drawn to the space tend to skew towards wanting to solve the most interesting technical problems. And sometimes that is the right thing to do when you're trying to do something breakthrough and interesting in the world. But sometimes the right thing to do is actually to not reinvent everything. And it's not to start from scratch. It's actually to say, this is not on the critical path, or our users don't really care about this. And you can only make those kinds of decisions and those kinds of trade-offs if you have a very clear definition for who you're building for and what problem you're solving. And I think too often protocol teams just don't do that. They just build horizontally. They build for everything. They don't make trade-offs. There's no hard decisions being made. And most of those I think will just fail in time. Whereas I think the people that are much more purposeful about who the users are, what problem they're solving, how they know it's a real problem, how they can track progress and measure progress, all of this, the best practices that made the internet work, and all the businesses and protocols and everything built on top of the internet, I think all of those best practices actually still apply. To your second question around talent, I think we've seen tremendous technical talent enter the space. I think we've seen, of all functions, whether it's product or design or engineering or partnerships, people who understand what this could become and have sort of a philosophical perspective that the centralization of power that's happened in technology over the last 25 years, both in private and public sector, concentration of power is unhealthy. And so you have a lot of those people. But by and large, you don't yet have the non-technical, like tier 1, 99th percentile operators yet in the space. And it's kind of, I think, goes back to another adage, which is, you can kind of tell a bubble is happening when there's a bunch of Harvard MBAs that show up, right? So like in 99, all the Harvard MBAs started showing up in Silicon Valley, and that was strong anti-signal. It's like, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. So in some sense, it's good that you don't have a bunch of those people here right now. And nothing, I mean, I have a lot of friends that have MBAs from HBS, so no knock against. It's just sort of culturally speaking, MBAs are generally trained to extract value and look at certain kinds of metrics and think about the world in a certain way. And so they're drawn to certain areas. And right now, by and large, those sorts of people are drawn to the internet because the size of the opportunity is so straightforward and obvious, right? SaaS is going to be 10x bigger than it is right now. Facebook and Google are going to be the biggest companies in the world, and Amazon and so on. And until the size of the opportunity is more obvious in crypto, I think you're not going to see that flood of talent come in. And so then one of the challenges and one of the opportunities, I think, for crypto companies is how do you pull those people in proactively? Because you're not going to like randomly bump into those people, and they're not randomly going to say, oh, I'm super interested in crypto, let me come join you. I think you have to be much more proactive about seeking out top tier product and design and partnerships and BD and all of these other functions that you need to actually build a successful ecosystem and a successful product. I think teams have to be much more proactive about going and getting those people.
And also, how do you think about like adoption overall, like in use cases that will unfold this year, next year? Do you think we're like far away from mainstream? Just like, your regular users actually using blockchain applications or like DeFi applications. Also, what do you think will unfold first?
So it's a tough question to answer, I think, because it goes back to this idea of, well, who really is your user and what problem are you really solving for them? And I think if you take the approach that your user might be a developer, you might say, well, actually, there are people that have like, interesting developer ecosystems, and there are some people here. And so you're starting to see some adoption. If you take the approach that your user doesn't necessarily even need to understand that they're using crypto, you might argue that the people who've gotten HELOCs from a company like Figure are actually mainstream crypto users. And actually a bunch of vertically integrated fintech companies, or let's say Libra launches, once Libra launches, that all of the people who are using Libra are actually mainstream crypto users, right? You could take that lens if you defined your user that way. Or, if you take the lens that a user here isn't actually human weighted, it's dollar weighted, which is to say, something like DeFi really should be looked at through the lens of dollars in the system, not number of CDPs or not number of users. Then you might argue, well, actually, it's starting to go kind of mainstream. Like a lot of ultra high net worth people have some exposure to crypto. A lot of institutions are starting to get exposure to crypto. So on a dollar-weighted basis, it's starting to happen. So, I think it's a tough question to answer because I think everybody has a slightly different definition of what it means to get mainstream users. And depending on how you define it, you could say, well, there are no mainstream users, or you might say, actually, we have some early adoption from quote-unquote mainstream users. But it all depends on kind of how you define what that is. I continue to think it's going to be these financial applications because the infrastructure is such a clear fit for those. And some of them will be DeFi, things like Maker or Compound, or Uniswap, where software can take custody of money and let you do really interesting things with it. And some of it will be more fintech, whether it's like Coinbase as an exchange or Binance, or things like Bitwise or Anchorage, sort of as like picks and shovels companies, or companies like Figure, where actually the end user may not even realize, or Libra, where they may not even realize that they're using crypto on the back end. I think those, if you look at all of those, by and large, they're basically financial or value exchange, or they're sort of crypto adjacent. Those I continue to think are going to be the first places where this actually goes mainstream. And I think if you believe that, then actually maybe a dollar weighted way to look at these things is not so crazy. Maybe actually a user weighted way to look at them is not as interesting. So, Coinbase custody having $20 billion worth of Bitcoin, that is actually the number to pay attention to. It kind of doesn't matter if it's 1,000 people or 1,500 people or 5,000 people. That's sort of secondary in my mind.
And do you think some people say like, well, DeFi space is very much like married to Ethereum, and there is like kind of like naturally a good fit there because of the way infrastructure works there? Do you see it kind of happening on other platforms right now or in the future?
I think in the future it certainly could. I don't think this is anywhere close to game over, whether you're talking about smart contracting platforms or even if you're talking about Bitcoin. I mean, I tend to be a Bitcoin rationalist, which is to say it's the most likely thing to hit massive scale and become a global store of value. But we're so early in the development of this that, just because the first 30 or 50 million people did a thing doesn't necessarily mean that the next 2 billion people to do it will do that thing. And the history of technology has shown us that over and over and over again. And so maybe Bitcoin wins, maybe it doesn't. Maybe Ethereum wins, maybe it doesn't. But I tend to think that as an investor, probabilistically speaking, the return profiles are such that it actually makes a lot of sense to have some exposure to things that are running at those same objectives, but are not Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so in the case of DeFi, yes, I think it's entirely possible that we don't know what the killer apps are yet, or that the killer apps have scaling challenges when it comes to Ethereum, and actually some other platform is able to bootstrap enough network security that they can build those sorts of applications. And because it's so much easier to get money in the door, that the liquidity feedback loop ends up being faster and faster on a new platform and ends up eclipsing Ethereum over the next 3 to 5 years. Very similar to, look back at the last generation of pure network effect businesses on the internet, which were social networks. And there was this moment in time around 2005 where there was just this Cambrian explosion of social networks because Friendster and MySpace showed that there was a market. And so every country had their own social network, in addition to Facebook and High Five and Bebo and Tagged and Orchid and like 1,000 social networks that we've forgotten about. And you're just seeing a very similar thing happen now, which is we have 20 smart contracting platforms that are going to run at DeFi with Ethereum. And at the time, it was not at all obvious that Facebook was going to win. Yeah, they had tons of growth and a great team. But the really subtle trade-offs that you make in a product sometimes end up mattering so much in the long term that it's almost it's almost impossible to know in the moment that was actually the killer thing. You take something as simple as real names, and you're like, oh, just the simple policy of on Facebook you use your real name, and on MySpace you didn't, has all of these dramatic downstream consequences. Like if you join the product, can you find your friends? And if it turns out nobody's using their real name, you can't find your friends. And then you friend a bunch of random people, and then actually the product gets worse the bigger that the product gets. And if everybody's using their real name, actually the product gets better the more people are using it. So you have a real network effect. Could anybody have pointed out in 2005 that actually like one of the killer features was going to be that you had to use your real name? There's like no way anybody could have known that at the time, right? And so I think we'll look back in 5 years and we'll say, oh, it totally turns out like these 3 things were the killer things, and that's what got the network effect to be awesome, and that lowered the friction to growth, and that got the liquidity network effects kicked in. And you can hypothesize about what those things are, but I don't think anybody really knows what those are going to be today. And I don't think when you're talking about maybe $1 billion locked in DeFi in USD terms, that you're talking about some sort of network effect that's insurmountable. Like that's actually a relatively small dollar amount in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's still open game. I think 5 years from now it'll be a different situation, but I think for the next 3 to 5 years we don't really know who's going to win.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to also end with just kind of understanding what kinds of teams you're seeing right now in terms of where are they coming from. Do you see a lot of Google, Facebook engineers joining the space, or is it more like younger generation, Web3 native generation, or is it like repeat entrepreneurs you're starting to see?
We're not seeing a ton, at least we at Electric are not seeing a ton of Facebook and Google engineers entering the space right now. There are some, but I think the opportunity cost for people in those ecosystems is quite high right now because it's a really, if you're in traditional Web 2, if you're at one of the big tech companies, you have a pretty great setup. Work-life balance is great, you get paid a lot, you get to work on really interesting problems at scale and so on. Now you are seeing some people leave because they're starting to realize and internalize that there were a number of knock-on effects and consequences of the way the internet was set up around the fundamental trade-offs that we made. We effectively traded off our privacy and control of our data in exchange for some of these products and services for free. And I think as more and more people realize that, some of those people will come over, but I think that's not really who we're seeing. What we're seeing much more of are people who are coming either out of startups or people coming out of finance. And I think the reason is that the people coming out of finance are, in some sense, they're like 20 years farther along on that trajectory of where tech is, right? In 20 years, tech is going to be clearly incumbents. It's going to have regulatory moats. It's not going to be oriented towards the user as it was, in 2005. And you're already starting to see that where the business objectives start to outweigh what the user really wants in some cases. And you just play that forward 20 years and really the metric becomes the goal. And that's kind of where a lot of the fintech world is today. It's like the banks are not really always aligned with their customers. And people in finance have seen that happen for so long that along comes a platform that says, wait a second, we can actually align all the incentives and those people all get it. And then the other population of people we're seeing are people who are coming out of startups. And these are people who have been who have tried startups or who have worked at successful startups, but not necessarily like Facebook scale. So you might have a company that was, solved some hard technology problem and was worth a couple $100 million and is large enough that it's going to be sustainable and it's going to be around and does something really interesting in the world, but it's not the next Facebook or Google. And there are a lot of those in Silicon Valley and all over the world now. And what's interesting about the people leaving those companies is they leave to start something and they look around and they say, okay, great. If I want to do something in e-commerce, is Amazon just going to crush me? If I do something in SaaS, is my best option just to sell to Salesforce? If I do something in social, does Facebook just crush me? If I do something in AI and ML, how do I compete against Google? Like you start thinking about it as an entrepreneur and you're like, wow, where do I go? Like, how do I actually do something where I'm not just going to get crushed by $1 trillion company? And it turns out this is a space, because the tech stack is so different, that the incumbents have a structural disadvantage. And so I think really smart entrepreneurs are starting to say, wait a second, if I want to do something that truly breaks out, I can go into a space where none of the incumbents are, none of the tech incumbents are. And that feels awesome as an entrepreneur because it's all greenfield. And so I think those people are actually coming into the space first, which is really positive. Like actually that's a good sign. It's kind of similar to that MBA conversation that we had, is like you kind of want people who are much more forward thinking. And I think that people that have seen startups be somewhat successful but have not become the incumbents are actually really great people to come into the space.
Well, thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go-to-market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.